a little bit by thinking. We'll start a little bit by thinking about what are social networks. So, social networks, in an academic sense, are patterns of relationships amongst social units of some sort. So I use the abstract term social unit because they can be individuals, or they can be groups, or they can be countries. They can be lots of different things. Today, when we think about social networks, very often the term is used synonymously with social media like Facebook or Twitter or other sorts of platforms. But social scientists have actually been studying social networks for well over 100 years. What I might do is make the distinction between social media networks or virtual networks and traditional networks. So this traditional networks would include things like friendship relations or acquaintanceship relations or relations with coworkers, those sorts of things that that are formed or might start outside of social media, but later on might be people might interact through social media. So I'm going to show you a few diagrams of different types of networks, just to give you a little bit of a flavor for some of the ways that social scientists think about social networks. So this is actually a little social network diagram I made up of a class I taught one time. And here this was a diagram describing who talks to who in the class. So the little arrows indicate who's communicating to whom. And we have different colors here, which I think was for people's gender. And then I think we also had different shapes for different degrees and programs and that sort of thing. Here's another network diagram that people are probably pretty familiar with. So you can use networks to portray all kinds of different things. So this would be like a family network, looking at the Simpsons and parent-child relationships. We can think about networks in terms of the world system. Think about globalization. So this is a network of world trade and manufactured goods. The data from this is somewhat older, but here you can see the larger the circle is, the more trade or the more interactions with other countries that a particular country has, and the smaller the circle, the less interaction that country has with other countries. This diagram here is an example of what's called a two-mode diagram. And here we have two different kinds of actors. The red dots are individuals who might belong to environmental organizations, the NGOs, and the blue squares are different environmental organizations. And so here you can see, Olivia, for example, at the top of the screen belongs to environmental group 11 and environmental group 9. Flora also belongs to those two groups. And one of the insights here is we can think about Olivia and Flora as being connected to one another through their involvement in these two different types of organizations. So a slightly different way of thinking about networks. So social networks are patterns of relationships amongst individuals and groups. So we're going to think now about some of the ways in which I'm just going to move this little the little camera thing on my screen here so I can see my slides a little bit better. So we're going to think about some of the ways in which social networks are important in social movements, such as action around climate change, for facilitating people's participation in these types of movements. Another way of thinking about social networks is the distinction between what we may call whole networks and ego networks or personal networks. So if you look at the image on the right of this screen, we have an individual in the middle, and the lines show all of his connections to other different individuals. And we can expand on this idea, looking at egocentric networks or personal networks, and think about the idea that each of the people that the ego is connected to also has their own network, and that's illustrated a little bit on the left. And we can think about these networks spreading out into space, right? And so people who are involved in climate action in various ways have network contacts to other people who are involved in other NGOs and in other movements, but they also have ties to family members and to neighbors and coworkers and maybe people they know through school and through religious organizations and lots of different things. So we can see networks kind of going out in space. One of the things that's kind of interesting if you think about networks in this kind of sense is that we're often not that far from other people in a network sense. So, for example, in Canada, I sometimes ask my students, if they had to pass a message on to someone in their network, how long, in terms of network ties, would it take them to get a message to Prime Minister Trudeau, or how long would it take them to get a message to, the Queen of England, if they could only pass things on to people they know, and then the person that they passed it on to could only pass it on to people they know. Surprisingly, it often only takes 3 or 4 connections to pass on those kinds of messages, at least in an imaginary kind of thought experiment. So, how are social networks implicated in things like social movements, the environmental movement? There's 4 basic ways they're implicated. One is social networks are important for initial recruitment and mobilization of members. I'm going to go through these and then kind of cycle back through them again. They're also important, social networks are important for linking together different organizations and different networks. They're important for helping to transmit ideas and other aspects of culture. And a fourth thing is they produce what's called social capital for group members. So actually having networks can be useful. It can be a useful kind of resource for various sorts of things. So if I go back to point 1 here, personal networks are implicated in initial recruitment and ongoing mobilization of social movement members. An idea that's often talked about is if I step back for a second, a question that's often asked is why do people get involved in things like social movements, like the environmental movement? And the common sense explanation is because people have certain beliefs or concerns, and they want to act on those beliefs or concerns. What social scientists have found is that very often there's a big gap between the proportion of the population who have particular beliefs and concerns and those who get involved. So, for example, a classic study of the peace movement in the Netherlands found that about 85 or 90% of the general population supported the goals of the peace movement, but only about 5% actually participated in anything. So there's a big gap between values and attitudes and so on, and whether or not people actually act. And what the researchers found is what made a difference for the people who acted is not only were they concerned about peace issues, but they also had social network ties to other people who were involved in the movement. With point number 2, as I mentioned, networks are important for linking together different groups. At the individual level, they're very important for coordinating actions. But they're also in what we might call the meso level. They're important for coalitions. And if we think about climate action, a lot of climate action involves coalitions of different groups from different sectors, such as environmental groups, but also various kinds of social justice groups and some religious groups and unions and other sorts of things. Network structures that transmit ideas and other aspects of culture. Here, the idea is that ideas, flow through social networks. I've done a little bit of research on the general public and some of the factors that influence having a plan to deal with climate change at the individual level. And one of the things, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later in this presentation, but one of the things that we found is that members of the general public who had a tie to someone in an environmental group were significantly more likely to have a plan for dealing with climate change. One of the things in the United States that gets quite a bit of attention is the idea of polarization. The idea that there's a significant segment of the U.S. population who, doesn't believe climate change is real and or doesn't believe it's worthwhile taking action. Here, one of the ways in which network structures play a role is that very often we have ties to people who are similar to ourselves. And if we're in that kind of a network or we're mostly interacting with people who are similar to ourselves, what happens is an echo chamber forms. Dana Fisher, who's an environmental sociologist at the University of Maryland at College Park, has talked about this and has done some research on members of Congress in the United States and looked at the extent to which people are getting information from diverse sources or mostly getting information from people who already have similar positions. And she found that, in fact, that's mostly what happens is people get information from people who they already agree with. And you just have the same information cycling around, people who think climate change is real and important, talking to other people who think climate change is real and important, and people who deny it's real, talking to other people who deny it's real. So that's kind of an interesting practical problem that people who are interested in social networks think about, and something for activists to try and overcome in various kinds of ways. The fourth point, networks that produce social capital. One way of thinking about this, so the pitch I'm trying to give you is that that people get involved in things like social movements to deal with climate action, in part through their social networks. People recruit them or ask them to participate, that sort of thing. But also, if people are active, you'll make new network connections, and I'm sure this is the case for most of the people listening in. That the activities and the organizations that you're involved in have led you to make new network connections. And this is important for the movement. It's kind of a reinforcing process that the more involved you are, the more ties you make, and then the more ties you make, the more that kind of reinforces your commitment to a certain extent. But you can also think about this in a different way, and the different way to think about this is that these ties are a kind of resource. And you can even use this as a kind of recruitment pitch that, if you're involved and engaged in this, in climate action, you'll develop a bigger network and perhaps a more diverse network. And this might be useful for other things later on that have nothing to do with climate action. It might be useful for getting a job, might be useful for traveling and finding out information. This is, a process that's really important to politicians. They often form networks in certain types of contexts and then draw upon their networks later on for political action. So social capital is a kind of resource that arises out of this kind of action. And social capital in this context just means having lots of social network ties to other people that can be a useful resource. So I'm just going to briefly talk a little bit about some of my own research. So I've done a number of surveys of people in environmental groups, and also of the general public. One of my studies was a random sample survey of the general public in Canada, and I asked them about their participation in different types of environmental activities and social movement activities and conservation activities, and whether or not they had ties to people in environmental organizations and those sorts of things. And so amongst members of the general public, if people had ties to members of NGOs, they were significantly more likely to donate money to an NGO. They were more likely to write a letter to a newspaper or company about an environmental issue. They were more likely to attend a community meeting about an environmental issue. They were more likely to attend a rally or demonstration. They were more likely to participate in a planning process about an environmental issue. They were more likely to support the NGOs through purchases of various sorts of things like posters and so on. They were more likely to vote for someone because of environmental issues. We can think about those things as kind of movementy types of activities. But in addition to that, they were also more likely to engage in what I might call environmentally friendly behavior. So if they had ties to members of environmental organizations, they're more likely to walk, bike, take public transit, more likely to carpool, more likely to conserve energy, more likely to buy organic or local produce, more likely to grow their own produce, more likely to use environmentally friendly cleaning products, more likely to reuse and mend things, more likely to help maintain parks and natural habitats, more likely to compost, more likely to conserve water, more likely to participate in cleanups of streams and lakes. So these, I would argue, are to some extent effects of having social network ties to people in environmental organizations. So what do social networks do? So there's a variety of things that they do when we're talking about personal networks, social network ties amongst individuals. So they're important for communication and disseminating information, as we've talked about. They're important for recruitment appeals. So, trying to bring people into the movement, or get people to come out to events. They're important for identification. So this is a significant social psychological process. So identification in this context means the extent to which a person identifies as part of a group or part of a movement. And what research shows is the more ties you have to people in, say, something like the environmental movement, the more strongly you'll tend to identify with the movement. Social network ties are important for social influence. So the idea that people may change their opinion about certain types of issues, like climate change, is tied to having network ties to other people who hold those types of opinions or positions. Social networks can be important for things like incentives or sanctions. So trying to give people rewards for doing things, or to some extent punishment for doing things. They can be important for social support. So here, social support can mean lots of different things, but at one level, just giving people emotional support for participating in things. But in other sorts of instances, maybe it's help in other ways, like helping people with transportation, or looking after kids, or maybe lending them some money, various other kinds of things. Social networks are important for socialization, so learning about issues, relatedly for knowledge and information about issues. They're important for personal efficacy. So the idea that you can make a difference. This is something that political scientists talk about. That that people are more likely to get involved in actions to try and create change if they think they can make a difference. And social networks give you some signals about whether or not you think you can make a difference, and importantly, whether or not other people are going to take action. They're important for norms, so patterns of behavior that become accepted patterns of behavior. They can affect what's called subjective interests, so changing people's interests about different types of policy positions, for example. They can affect beliefs about others' willingness to contribute. So if you think other people are going to contribute to collective action, then you're more likely to contribute. And if you have social network ties to other people, you have more information about others' willingness to contribute. This point here, I would say, is actually one of the features of social media that's kind of interesting compared to traditional networks. That in things like Facebook, for example, you can look at other people's profiles and get a sense of, whether or not they're planning to, say, attend a meeting or something like that, or go to an event, and that might help influence your own willingness to participate in the event. Uh, Trust is also an important thing for a lot of activities around social movements and climate change. And the better, the more ties you have, the denser your network is, the more that you'll trust people that are part of that network. And so that's another important social psychological process. So we'll think a little bit now about some other aspects of networks. In some of my research, I've developed a theoretical model. This is kind of a quick diagram that just kind of shows how a number of different aspects of this are interconnected. So the big box on the left is just representing, the extent to which people have ties to other people in the environmental movement. And what my research suggests is that, the more ties that people have, the more requests they receive to participate in activities, the more they communicate with other people about environmental issues, the more strongly they identify with the movement, and then the more active they get in terms of things like the number of different activities that they engage in the movement, such as, say, attending a protest rally or writing a letter, those sorts of things. So let's think a little bit now about virtual social networks. So mostly what I've been talking about is, what I might call traditional networks, or, networks that exist, aside from social media. But it's interesting to think a little bit about, the similarities and differences between traditional social networks and virtual social networks. So, to some extent, we can think about people that are linked together through the internet and through social media as a type of social network, and we can think about platforms like Facebook and Twitter. One thing that I would say about social media in particular is that they serve at least two different purposes, at least that are relevant in this context. One purpose is the social network function. The other purpose is the media function. And so people are connected through Facebook or Twitter or other sorts of things. And to some extent, that's similar to having friendships and acquaintanceships and so on outside of the web. But they also use these platforms to get information about the world. A lot of people actually access mainstream media through social media, and of course they access other forms of media. So social media is kind of doing both of these things at the same time. They're providing a platform for media, but they're also providing a virtual structure for social networks. Some people have argued that new media technologies, like we're talking about, have the potential to level the playing field. So compared to um, the situation in previous decades, the cost of getting information out is a lot cheaper, or requires a lot less effort or other kinds of resources than it used to. So it's easier to get things out through social media than for activists than it is through newspapers and television and radio. And in fact, in many instances, successfully getting information out through social media is then an indirect way of getting into more mainstream types of media. Um, these new media provide opportunities for social movement leaders to recruit individuals who may be less accessible than through traditional media, such as television and newsprint, which is also quite important, certainly for younger people today. At least, when I talk to my university students, many more people access information through social media than get a daily newspaper subscription. Um, Also, new media provide opportunities for interactions with what I might call rank and file members of the movement. So they provide opportunities where, for leaders to interact with, people who might be a little bit more peripherally involved in the movement than in the pre-social media days. Jennifer Earle and some of her colleagues have talked about some of these ideas, and they debated a little bit in the literature. One thing that's debated in the literature is the extent to which social media just magnifies traditional processes, traditional social movement processes, which they call supersizing social movements, versus the extent to which it actually is a game changer, and that's something that scholars are debating as we speak. A few more things that I'll say here. Some of this will be obvious, and maybe some of it won't be quite as obvious. I mean, so on the more obvious front, social media can provide information about events, providing information about substantive and ideological issues. This can be done, very efficiently, and through social media. Links can be provided to URLs and that sort of thing, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with. Something that's maybe a little bit less obvious is social media can provide an indicator of the numbers of others who support or participate in a movement, and from the individual perspective can affect the tipping point or threshold for influencing one's participation. So in the old days, the pre-social media days, you might hear about something, some kind of event or some kind of campaign you might hear about, on the radio or in the newspaper, but you're not really sure, who's involved and who's, maybe going to attend the event. But in social media, you have a better sense of that, and that might influence your decision to get involved. So social media can provide what social psychologists would refer to as reference points for self-other comparisons. And here, if you think about people you're relatively more close to, you might think about the extent to which they're involved in various kinds of activities, and that might influence your likelihood of participating. But it can also affect your identification. So if you have close friends who identify with a particular type of movement, you're going to be more likely to identify with that movement yourself. So I've talked a bit about social networks, mainstream media, and social media. So I guess this is a little bit repetitive. So I'm just going to flip through to flip over a few slides here. Now, I did talk about the idea of echo chambers, the idea that with traditional networks, often people have ties to people who are mostly similar to themselves, and often have similar views about things. This is a problem that can get magnified with social media and internet stuff, and is sometimes referred to as webcasting, when you only make ties to or only set up feeds to media that tend to support the views that you already have. And so this is kind of the social media equivalent of the echo chamber problem that I think activists need to work on. Otherwise, they end up with this problem of what's sometimes called preaching to the choir. So what are some of the benefits of networking and strategies for expanding and maintaining social networks? Targeting past participants. So if you have links to people who participated in the past in various events and activities, research has shown that people who have participated in the past are also the most likely to participate in future events. So rounding up the usual suspects. In some of the research that I've done, I've found that people with a greater number of ties to people in environmental groups are more likely to receive requests to participate in events, and also participate in various kinds of conservation activities. One reason for this, why people are more willing to participate, is what's called a diffusion of responsibility effect. So, for example, when people send out, say, an email, let's say, and just talk about a particular event that's going on, but you don't tailor it specifically to people. You just send out a general announcement. People are much less likely to participate than if you specifically target them. So if you specifically target people through your social network, and you say, Gabrielle, how would you like to do this thing on Saturday? Then Gabrielle is much more likely to participate if she's specifically targeted. And social psychologists refer to this as the diffusion of responsibility effect. If you specifically target people through social networks as opposed to just sending broadband messages, individuals will feel more social pressure to participate in different types of activities. Um, Now, I've talked a little bit about the idea that in addition to people participating because of their networks, if they participate in social movements, they actually develop richer networks and more diverse networks. One of the studies that I conducted looked at people in the environmental movement in British Columbia, and we found that people who are more engaged in the environmental movement actually developed a greater number of ties to people outside of the movement in a wider variety of occupations. And so they had richer networks to people outside of the movement, which, hypothetically could be used as a resource for various kinds of things, like getting a job, for example, or trying to find out information for some task of some sort. Research has also shown that social network ties from members of environmental organizations to the general public can have positive, non-trivial consequences. And here I'll just talk a little bit about the study that we did of ties from the general public to people in environmental organizations. So in the environmental movement literature, there's an argument that's sometimes made called the death of environmentalism, or the death of environmentalism thesis. And what this argument suggests is that, at least for big, relatively bureaucratic organizations, these types of organizations have tended to kind of take their memberships for granted, and have kind of seen members as mostly as donors, and that a lot of the action really goes on at the head offices with professional staff and that sort of thing. We tried to test these ideas, and in particular by looking at some issues around social networks. And so we did a nationwide survey in Canada of people in environmental organizations, and also of the general public. So amongst people in environmental organizations, we actually found that about 81% of people in environmental organizations advocated for environmental protection within their social networks. So these are rank and file members of groups like, say, Sierra Club or Greenpeace or World Wildlife Fund. We found that about 60% of environmentalists talk with someone about environmental issues at least once a week, including 12% who discuss environmental issues every day. And about 35% of environmentalists encourage someone to participate in ENGO activities at least several times a year. And here's a few graphs just describing some of these things. So what is this information telling you? What it's telling you is that, at least as far as some of the organizations that we studied, this death of environmentalism idea isn't really completely true, to the extent to which people who belong to these organizations are not doing nothing. They are talking to people. They're talking to people quite often. They're asking them to participate in movement activities, and asking them to participate in conservation activities and that sort of thing. So then the question becomes, does it make a difference? Does it make a difference, or are they just, basically preaching to the choir? And so what we sought out to study was whether or not individuals amongst the general public have a personal plan to deal with climate change. And we had this idea that, focused on social networks and looked at the question of whether or not having ties to environmental organization movement members affected plans to deal with climate change amongst members of the general public. And so this was members of the general public who did not themselves belong to an environmental organization. And we asked them a variety of questions. We had some open-ended questions and asked them about the types of different types of activities that they were planning to engage in. When they talked about having a plan, I'm just going to take a quick break here. And some of these things included, changing their transportation habits, like maybe taking public transport instead of driving, focusing on waste reduction, reducing energy use, and some other sorts of things that are described in this table. So then we collected a bunch of survey data on different questions. And so what this table does is it provides a multivariate statistical model explaining whether or not members of the general public have a plan to deal with climate change. And the main finding that's of interest here is that we found if people had network ties to individuals in environmental organizations, they were significantly more likely to have a plan to deal with climate change. And this effect persisted even when we statistically controlled for other sorts of things. So we controlled for how concerned they were about climate change, for example. We controlled for their views about environmental issues, and we controlled for a variety of socio-demographic factors such as education, income, gender, age, and so on. So the takeaway message here is that for people that are in environmental organizations, is that talking to people has a significant positive effect. People who are members of environmental organizations who have ties to people in the general public who don't belong to environmental organizations can affect their behavior and their plans. And we see this partly as a social network effect that relates to some of the other sorts of things that I've been talking about here. But it also, illustrates for activists, this is, that there are some positive benefits to talking to people. I think I will just I'll just mention that that study I was just talking to was published in Nature Climate Change, if people are interested in reading a little bit about it. And I'll just stop there and take questions.
Super. Thank you, David. Does anybody have any questions? You can either type them in the chat box and we can discuss them here, or you can turn on your videos if you would like and your microphones. I know sometimes some of you are sitting at your work buildings, so please, do feel free to write them. If not, I have some questions. But I suppose that's taking advantage of my position. So does anyone have anything that comes to mind? I guess I can ask one to start, David. I was wondering about sort of this like echo and this social homogeneity. And I guess I was wondering the type of research that people do when they find that this is something that's happening. So people are sort of staying within their own social networks, whether it's actually a traditional social network or sort of a modern social network. My newsfeed on like my Guardian app that gives me only like the environmental stuff or the things that I look at. Is there a way that they talk about to sort of, I guess, weaken that sort of feedback loop or to break it?
Yeah. So, I guess it depends on who you're talking about at one level. If I kind of I guess descend to stereotypes and think about the United States and think about somebody who's relatively conservative and who gets most of their news from, say, Fox News or something like that, and has, most of their friends are, Republicans, and they I don't know, go to church together, and so on. Um, Kind of interacting with people in that type of network would be an example of an echo chamber type of thing. And from if I sort of put on my hat and say I'm concerned about climate action, how do I deal with that? Um, it's a little bit difficult to think about that particular example because they might not be all that interested in changing things. But I would say that as people who are interested in climate action and are climate activists, I think what's important there is actually trying to form ties to people outside of the usual suspects. So people who are climate activists, or to some extent progressives, more generally speaking, tend to have higher levels of education, tend to have left-leaning types of views. In certain countries, are often from certain types of ethnic backgrounds. Um, and there, I think what you need to do is really go out of your way to try and establish social network contacts with people who are outside of those characteristics, and really work at talking to people that are maybe blue collar workers, talking to people that are more conservative, and thinking about ways of communicating with people who have different views. I think to one extent, to some extent, this is something that various groups I think are working on, and that's interesting. It's also something that's of debate to some extent. But again, if you think about the United States, it used to be that a lot of the more conservative religious groups were were skeptical that climate change was real and was something that needed to be dealt with, or they had a framework that sort of said that they shouldn't bother dealing with it even if it was real for various religious
Mhm.
reasons. Um, I think that that's changing very much, and there's a lot of conservative religious groups in the United States that are concerned about climate change and want to take action. And there, I think people that are kind of more on the left can, try and work with these groups and try to understand their values and see ways in which you can connect. Um, you know, Setting religion aside, there's also, to some extent, this schism more generally amongst the left and the right in some countries. I mean, some of what I'm talking about, I think, people who are listening will probably say, well, what you're talking about is maybe true of North America or the United States, and maybe less true of Europe. And I think that's probably the case. But even in terms of just left right politics, there are a certain proportion of people who are more right wing, more conservative, who like to work through markets and stuff like that, who are willing to do stuff around climate change through things like carbon taxes and so on, but are not necessarily willing to support a lot of the interventions that more progressives um, favor. And there, I mean, I don't have any simple solutions to that gap. But what I would say is that people should, activists should, really try to engage with people with different political views and see to what extent, they do have common ground. So if I think about the carbon tax example, it's possible in many instances for the left and the right to agree on carbon taxes. What you do with the carbon tax, on the other hand, is something that they might not agree about.
Mhm. And so so I guess the onus then of making these like social networks that then actually do have a really big impact is almost on the people that are already part of that social network, in the sense of it, if it's like the environmental activists, it's them that should go seek out ties, say with like industry, to see if like they can establish sort of a link there, or ties between, say, like stakeholders that aren't maybe interested yet.
Yes, I think that that's true. I mean, I would also say to some extent, for politicians, the onus should be on politicians to also do a similar sort of thing. Um, Although I suspect some politicians would be interested in this, and other politicians would not be very interested in this. I mean, in Canada and in the U.S., there's some examples of politicians that try to cross the aisle to on climate matters to deal with this issue, but not as much as would be desirable. I would also say in Canada, where I'm based, um, there's a number of environmental activists who have worked with oil companies and stuff like that. So, for example, Support Burman, who's one of Canada's leading environmental activists, has done a lot of work with people in the oil sector, and also work with governments and stuff like that.
Hmm. Thanks. I see there's a question in the chat box. It's from Alicia. I don't know if
Okay.
you can see that, David, but I can read it out if you want for just
Yeah, so I can read it. It might not hurt for you to read it out to everyone. I'm just going to take a quick look here.
So for others, so Lisa is asking that it happens more and more often that people believe less information read on social networks like Facebook. It seems that Facebook is considered as less reliable than Twitter, for instance. In fact, everyone can say their opinion, a lot of information, even contrasting, and these are streamed every day. A lot of false news or information are diffused in news feeds, and it's often difficult to understand which is the truth. So, how do we solve this problem? Should we find the truth, in quotations, outside of social media? So, shall we use social media just like a general and superficial channel for information that should be, anyways, checked from outside sources? Um, could this affect part of the benefits of social media as a role and scope?
Yeah, so I have a few thoughts on this. This is a very interesting question. One thing I would do is I would start by saying something about non-social media, and that is, there's this kind of idea sometimes that people are directly influenced by the media, so they read a story or read an op-ed or something like that, and develop a position about an issue, and it's a direct effect. What social network researchers have said that in the past, they've made the argument to some extent, people are a little bit more ambivalent or neutral on the media that they actually read initially, until they've actually talked to people in their networks, right? And so they kind of whatever stand around the water cooler and talk about news stories, or sometimes talk about newspaper articles, and try and get a sense of what other people think about them, and then based partly on what their network contacts think about the story, then develop an opinion. So even amongst mainstream media sources, there's a bit of that. With the social media specific question, and the issue of mainstream media being in a social media news feed, or whatever. I would say more generally, a lot of the things that should apply to just kind of critical thinking or critical reasoning should be applied to this sort of thing. I mean, first of all, you should see whether or not multiple sources are saying something similar, and especially if multiple sources that have diverse views on things are saying something similar, then you probably have more confidence in it. Um, it's also the case that probably if you have contacts in Facebook or Twitter, that there's some people that have more or less expertise on certain types of topics. So generally speaking, we wouldn't take all things that are shared, we wouldn't give them all equal weight. We would, distinguish a little bit whether somebody who actually has some expertise on a certain topic, or whether or not somebody has, a particular, say, interest of some sort, a political interest or financial interest, is saying something versus somebody who is seen as being relatively neutral. I would also say, it's useful to diversify, your social media. So, I mean, I think of myself as, I don't know, a somewhat leftish person, probably a center left person in terms of politics and ideology. But on Twitter, I actually follow lots of right wing people, partly to get a sense of what they're saying. Um, and I think kind of having a diversity of sources like that, similar to having a diversity of network ties, it gives you more, you might say it gives you more data points, and the extent to which there's some commonality between the data points, you might have more confidence in the information. And if there's differences in the data points, it sometimes gives you an idea about whether or not people are disagreeing, purely along ideological lines, or whether something else is going on.
So actually, I guess making the effort to follow people that disconcert us on social media can help in that type of case.
Yeah, I mean, so the U.S. election, I've been finding quite interesting, because there's, even though the U.S. election right now is very polarized, um, there's a number of conservative right wing thinkers who completely don't support Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's actually quite interesting and somewhat revealing to see what the difference is between the conservatives who support Trump and don't support Trump, and I think kind of provides additional insight into what's going on.
Mm-hmm. That's super interesting. I enjoy the question because I think that's something really interesting, saying that everybody has an opinion, and that question of is everyone's opinion equal and how do we decide that is interesting. I like the idea of bringing in these different data points to sort of like suss it out yourself. Yes, later on Friday when we have another our last webinar of the series, we're talking about sort of like analyses methods to sort of look at evidence and information and form an opinion. So I think that's probably that's a good way to start as well when you're looking at evidence, like what is supporting that idea. Um, does anybody else have any questions they would like to ask, typed or spoken? Alicia says thank you, David. I don't know if you see that.
Yeah, I just saw that flash up.
Yeah, so please feel free to unmute your mic if you guys would like to, if you have a question or not. I know I was actually just thinking, David, about a specific graph you showed, I think, from the study where you were looking, there was where you did the analyses there, and you were showing what was significant and non. You were saying even when you controlled for climate, it was significant, sort of the network links. And I noticed that, yeah, I think it was this one, and I noticed that here, yeah, exactly, you have circled here. You actually have age circled as a significant effect, but youth, which in your study is like under 30, still has a negative correlation, but isn't significant. So, like, what did you guys think there when you saw those results? Like, so I guess the negative correlation sort of indicating that the younger you are, the more you had a plan to deal with climate change.
Yeah, so here, I mean, age is quite an interesting thing for a variety of reasons, and might be interesting for people listening to this. Um, and so I have a variety of thoughts here. Maybe I'll just talk about the table first, and then I'll elaborate on that. I mean, all of the table, all of the table is saying in terms of the age effect, which is near the bottom there with the blue oval, is it saying that, all things being equal, the younger you are, the more likely you are to have a plan to deal with climate change. And so then what the youth effect is saying is in a sense asking the question: is this effect just for people who are under 30, or
Mm,
is it kind of more of a linear effect? Is it, the younger you are? And so it turns out, at least with the data that we have here, it's not just people who are under 30, but it's more of a
mm,
linear effect. So in other words, people who are, say, 40 are more likely to have a plan than people who are 65, right? So
mm.
it's not just an under 30 thing. um, but but why is age important? I mean, a couple of thoughts that I have about this is, one is that there's a lot more environmental education now than there used to be. So I teach several courses at UBC on environmental topics, but when I was younger, there was not really anything in terms of education in high schools on environmental topics, except for sort of basic natural science stuff like biology and so on. um, but most people, at least in Canada and stuff, who graduate have some environmental education. So younger people are more informed about environmental issues. It's also the case that there's been a variety of important environmental crises or issues or problems that have arisen. Obviously, we're talking about climate change right now, but there's also the hole in the ozone. There's also been various um, crises involving nuclear power, such as the Fukushima thing, and earlier than that, sort of probably before people who are listening in were born, there was also the disaster at 3 Mile Island in the U.S. and Chernobyl and in the Ukraine. And there's a lot of talk about species extinction and so on. Um, so on the environmental side, younger people are better educated and they've been exposed to a variety of environmental problems and disasters that to some extent didn't exist at the same scale for people who are older cohorts. But another part of this that's interesting is that in terms of the activism part of it, younger people tend to be younger people who are engaged in activism tend to be more active because they're better able to. They have more flexible schedules, and they're better able to engage in a variety of different types of activities. They usually don't have the same sorts of constraints that, say, middle aged people with who are raising children and perhaps tied into careers have. So youth tend to be both more concerned about environmental issues, but also more able to engage to deal with them.
So I guess like a good resource to sort of reach out to in terms of social networks, when you like think about reaching out to people outside to make that social network, I suppose like that indicates also that it's a good place to look, just that they can be more active and they are more active, I would imagine. Um,
Yeah, so I would add, there's a bit of a paradox in some of the data that I've collected, and that is that in terms of pure survey data, um, youth, or at least in North America, are often less involved in things, are less likely to be, say, members of organizations. And, that's for a variety of reasons. Sometimes there's barriers to joining organizations, or sometimes the organizations are not very receptive or focused on youth issues and that sort of thing. So overall, the average youth is less likely to be a member of an organization, but amongst the people who are members of organizations or are involved in movements, youth are actually more active. So you kind of have both of those effects going on at the same time. And so I guess the take home message is that if you can recruit younger people to participate in actions, those people that you recruit are actually going to be more active than older people are.
hmm. Yeah, really interesting. Especially that like trade off of like they're not really involved, but when they do, they go like way over the way. There's also interesting stuff I think on over engagement. So does anybody else have any questions? I know we're getting to the end of the time we usually wrap up at. So unless there's any other questions, I can, I guess, close up. Does anyone have any comments, questions before we finish? If you do have stuff that comes up later, as always, feel free to email me. And if it's a question for Dr. Tindall, I can always forward that along as well. Otherwise, thank you so much, David. I found it very, very interesting, and thanks for spending the time with our group of youth. And hopefully, you guys can take some of this information we learned on what social networks are and how they work and what are sort of the opportunities there, and bring that into the type of challenges and solutions you guys will be thinking about around environmental governance, especially engaging other people, maybe people that we usually don't think about. So thank you very much, and you have a great week. And please don't forget about the webinar on Friday. Youth participants in the program, you guys are expected there. It's at 3 p.m. Central European time. And I look forward to seeing you then.
Hey, thank you very much. Bye.